The grand ballroom of Valdoria Palace sparkled under thousands of crystal chandeliers, their light dancing across the marble floors like scattered diamonds. King Alexander stood at the far end of the hall, his tall frame rigid beneath the ceremonial navy uniform adorned with golden braids and medals. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the gathering of European nobility, diplomats, and dignitaries who had traveled from across the continent for this momentous occasion. Tonight marked the 20th anniversary of his reign, but the celebration felt hollow. The weight of recent events pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible crown made of lead rather than gold. Behind him, through the tall windows, the kingdom's capital stretched out in the darkness, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Those people trusted him, believed in him, and yet he felt more isolated than ever before. Queen Isabella entered the ballroom through the main doors, her emerald silk gown flowing behind her like liquid luxury. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, was arranged in an elaborate updo secured with the Valdorian sapphire tiara. She moved with practiced grace, acknowledging the respectful bows and curtsies of the guests with measured nods. Her smile never wavered, though Alexander could see the strain around her green eyes from across the room. Their marriage had begun as a political alliance 25 years ago, uniting two powerful noble houses and strengthening Valdoria's position in the region. Over time, they had grown comfortable together, sharing mutual respect and understanding. Isabella had proven herself a capable queen, involved in numerous charitable causes and representing the crown with dignity at state functions. Yet something fundamental had shifted between them in recent months, creating a chasm that seemed to widen with each passing day. The crisis had begun 3 months earlier, when documents surfaced suggesting corruption within the royal treasury. Opposition politicians seized upon the scandal, demanding investigations and accountability. The media, once respectful of the royal family's privacy, now scrutinized every decision, every public appearance, every gesture between the king and queen. Trust that had taken decades to build crumbled in weeks. Alexander watched as Isabella approached a group of foreign ambassadors, seamlessly switching between French, German, and English as she engaged them in conversation about trade agreements and cultural exchanges. She had always possessed this talent for diplomacy, making others feel valued and heard. It was one of the qualities that had made their partnership successful, even if passion had never been its foundation. Lord Chancellor Reginald Blackwood materialized at Alexander's elbow, his weathered face creased with concern. The elderly statesman had served 3 generations of Valdorian monarchs, his loyalty absolute and his counsel invaluable. His gray beard was meticulously groomed, and his ceremonial robes bore the ancient symbols of his office. "Your Majesty," Blackwood murmured, his voice barely audible above the string quartet's melodic performance. "The Prime Minister requests a private audience before the evening concludes. The parliamentary vote is scheduled for tomorrow, and there are developments you should know about." Alexander nodded grimly. The Parliament would vote on whether to launch a formal investigation into the royal finances, potentially stripping the monarchy of much of its traditional authority. The leaked documents had revealed suspicious transfers of funds, contracts awarded to companies with unclear connections to the royal family, and expenses that seemed excessive even by royal standards. While Alexander maintained his innocence, the evidence painted a troubling picture that his enemies exploited ruthlessly. "Has there been any progress in identifying the source of the leaks?" Alexander asked, his voice low and controlled. Blackwood shook his head slightly. "Our investigations continue, but whoever orchestrated this has covered their tracks expertly. The timing suggests coordination with political opponents, but proving conspiracy remains challenging." Across the ballroom, Princess Elena Montclair entered with her characteristic quiet elegance. Alexander's daughter-in-law had married his eldest son, Crown Prince Marcus, 3 years earlier in a ceremony that had captured the nation's imagination. Unlike the arranged marriage between Alexander and Isabella, Marcus and Elena's union had been founded on genuine love, their courtship playing out like a fairy tale that gave the monarchy a modern, romantic image. Elena wore a flowing midnight blue gown that complemented her dark hair, which cascaded over one shoulder in loose waves. Her presence immediately drew attention, not merely because of her title, but due to her natural warmth and authenticity. In her short time as a member of the royal family, she had won over both the public and the press with her dedication to social causes and her ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Marcus was notably absent tonight, having been deployed overseas with his military regiment 2 weeks earlier. The young prince served as a helicopter pilot in the Royal Air Force, insisting on taking the same risks as any other officer, despite his position in the line of succession. His deployment had come at an unfortunate time, leaving Elena to navigate the current crisis without her husband's support. Alexander observed as Elena gracefully moved through the crowd, pausing to speak with elderly nobles, young diplomats, and everyone in between. She possessed an intuitive understanding of what each person needed from their interaction with royalty, sometimes formality, sometimes warmth, always respect. Her genuine interest in others made her a natural ambassador for the monarchy during these troubled times. The king's relationship with Elena had developed slowly. Initially, he had been skeptical of his son's choice, wondering if a commoner could truly understand the responsibilities and sacrifices required of royal life. Elena's background was solidly middle class. Her father was a respected physician, her mother a university professor. She had earned her own degree in international relations and worked for several humanitarian organizations before her engagement to Marcus. However, Elena had proven herself repeatedly, adapting to royal protocols while maintaining her authentic personality. She brought fresh perspectives to family discussions and wasn't afraid to respectfully challenge traditional approaches when she believed change would benefit the monarchy or the people they served. Alexander had come to value her insights and appreciate her dedication to duty. The orchestra began playing a waltz, and couples moved onto the dance floor in the center of the ballroom. Alexander knew he should ask Isabella to dance. It was expected, part of the performance they maintained for public consumption. Yet tonight, the thought of going through those motions felt unbearable. The physical space between them during a formal dance would only emphasize the emotional distance that had grown in their marriage. Instead, he found himself walking toward Elena, who stood near a display of historical portraits depicting previous Valdorian monarchs. She was studying a painting of King Ferdinand the Bold, Alexander's great-grandfather, who had led the kingdom through a devastating war and emerged victorious against overwhelming odds. He faced impossible choices, Elena said softly as Alexander approached, not turning from the painting. The history books make it sound heroic, but I imagine he felt terrified and alone much of the time. Alexander joined her in contemplating his ancestors' stern expression, captured in oil paint nearly a century ago. Leadership often means making decisions without certainty, acting on incomplete information while accepting full responsibility for the consequences. Ferdinand understood that. Is that how you feel now? Elena asked, finally turning to meet his gaze. Her dark eyes held compassion rather than judgment, a quality that made her easy to confide in. The burden of the crown has never felt heavier, Alexander admitted. Every choice I make affects millions of people. The scandal threatens not just my reign, but the entire institution of monarchy in Valdoria. If I fail, I betray centuries of tradition and the trust of our citizens. Elena nodded thoughtfully. But you're not facing this alone. The people who matter, who truly know you, understand your character and integrity. That includes your family, your closest advisors, and many citizens who refuse to believe the worst without proof. Her words offered comfort, but Alexander felt the weight of isolation nonetheless. Isabella, while publicly supportive, had grown distant in their private moments. She fulfilled her royal duties perfectly but seemed to be merely going through the motions. Their conversations had become increasingly formal, focused on schedules and obligations, rather than sharing thoughts or seeking each other's counsel. Sometimes I wonder if Isabella believes the accusations, Alexander said, the admission surprising him with its honesty. She's always been pragmatic, and the evidence, while fabricated, appears convincing. Elena was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Queen Isabella loves Valdoria and everything it represents. Her whole life has been dedicated to serving this kingdom. Right now, she's probably afraid of losing everything she's worked to build. Afraid of letting down the people who depend on royal leadership. Fear can make people withdraw, even from those they care about most. The insight struck Alexander as both perceptive and generous. Elena had a talent for seeing multiple perspectives, understanding the complex emotions and motivations that drove people's behavior. It was part of what made her so effective in her royal role, and so valuable as a family member. Marcus chose wisely, Alexander said with a slight smile. You bring wisdom and compassion to our family that we desperately need. Elena's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. I just try to remember that behind every title and role is a human being dealing with hopes, fears, and uncertainties like everyone else. Across the ballroom, Isabella caught sight of Alexander and Elena in conversation. For a brief moment, her composed expression faltered, revealing something that might have been longing or regret. Then she turned back to her companions, resuming her animated discussion of cultural preservation initiatives with the visiting dignitaries. The evening continued with its prescribed rituals, toasts honoring the king's service, presentations of gifts from foreign nations, and performances by renowned musicians. Alexander participated in each element dutifully, but his mind remained focused on the challenges ahead. Tomorrow's parliamentary vote would determine the immediate future of his reign and possibly the long-term survival of the monarchy in its current form. As the final dance of the evening began, tradition dictated that Alexander should take the floor with Isabella. The assembled guests watched expectantly as the royal couple approached each other in the center of the ballroom. Alexander extended his hand to his wife, and she accepted it with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They moved through the familiar steps of the traditional Valdorian waltz, their bodies maintaining perfect distance and form. To observers, they appeared every inch the regal couple, graceful and united. Yet Alexander could feel the tension in Isabella's posture, the way she avoided direct eye contact, the mechanical precision of her movements that suggested duty rather than joy. When the music ended and the applause died down, Isabella immediately stepped away, curtsying formally before moving to thank the musicians. The gesture, while appropriate, felt like a dismissal that cut deeper than any harsh words might have. Alexander stood alone on the dance floor for a moment, surrounded by hundreds of people yet feeling profoundly isolated. The weight of tomorrow's uncertainties pressed down on him like a physical force. He had built his reign on principles of integrity, service, and connection with his people. Now all of that was under attack, and he wasn't certain he possessed the strength to defend it successfully. The evening wound down with the gradual departure of guests, each group taking their formal leave according to strict protocols. Alexander received their thanks and well-wishes with appropriate responses, maintaining his regal bearing despite his inner turmoil. As the ballroom slowly emptied, he retreated to his private study, needing solitude to process the day's events and prepare for whatever tomorrow would bring. The study, lined with leather-bound books and historical artifacts, had always been his sanctuary. Here, surrounded by the wisdom of ages and reminders of his kingdom's rich heritage, he could think clearly and find perspective on even the most challenging problems. Tonight, however, even this beloved refuge felt oppressive, filled with shadows that seemed to whisper of failures and endings. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gardens, as Alexander sat in his private breakfast room, untouched newspapers scattered across the mahogany table. The headlines screamed accusations and speculation in bold fonts designed to capture attention and sell papers. Royal finances under fire dominated the front page of the National Herald, while the conservative Tribune proclaimed, "Monarchy in crisis. Parliament votes today." Alexander pushed the papers aside and focused on the window overlooking the rose garden that had been his mother's pride. The carefully tended beds now showed signs of early autumn, their blooms fading as the seasons changed. Like everything else in his world, what had once seemed permanent and beautiful was proving temporary and fragile. Isabella entered quietly, already dressed in her formal day attire, a navy wool suit with pearl accessories that conveyed both authority and restraint. Her movements were precise and economical, suggesting she had already been awake for hours handling correspondence and preparing for the day's challenges. She poured herself coffee from the silver service but remained standing, creating physical distance that spoke louder than words. "The Prime Minister called," she announced without preamble. "The vote has been moved up to 10 this morning. They want to conclude the matter quickly and limit media speculation." Alexander studied his wife's face, searching for any sign of the partnership they had once shared. Her expression remained carefully neutral, professional, rather than personal. It was the same face she presented to cabinet ministers and foreign dignitaries, respectful but detached. "What are your plans for today?" he asked, hoping to engage her in something resembling normal conversation. "The Children's Hospital dedication ceremony at 2 o'clock, followed by the Literacy Foundation board meeting," Isabella replied efficiently. "I've reviewed all the briefing materials. The hospital administrators are particularly excited about the new pediatric wing it will serve families throughout the region." Her commitment to duty remained unwavering even as their personal relationship deteriorated. Alexander admired this quality, while simultaneously feeling distanced by it. Isabella approached everything, including their marriage, as a responsibility to be managed rather than a relationship to be nurtured. "Isabella," he began carefully, "I know these past months have been difficult. The accusations, the media attention, the uncertainty about our future, it's taken a toll on both of us. Perhaps we should talk about how we're managing through this together." She paused in stirring her coffee, her spoon creating tiny whirlpools in the dark liquid. For a moment, he thought she might open up, share her fears or frustrations, allow him to offer comfort or support. Instead, she set the cup down untouched and smoothed invisible wrinkles from her skirt. "We both have our duties today, Alexander. The kingdom requires us to fulfill our obligations regardless of personal concerns. I suggest we focus on serving our people rather than analyzing our marriage." The dismissal stung more than any argument might have. Alexander recognized the coping mechanism when overwhelmed. Isabella retreated into formality and duty, using royal protocol as armor against emotional vulnerability. It was effective but isolating, creating barriers that grew higher with each interaction. After Isabella departed for her morning appointments, Alexander prepared for the short journey to Parliament. His security detail had been increased due to protests outside the building. Though the demonstrations remained peaceful, citizens held signs demanding transparency and accountability, their faces reflecting the disappointment and confusion he felt himself. Lord Blackwood accompanied him in the royal car, briefing him on expected procedures and potential outcomes. The Chancellor's weathered hands held a leather folder containing contingency plans for various scenarios, from complete vindication to constitutional crisis. "The opposition has the votes to authorize the investigation," Blackwood said grimly. "Our intelligence suggests the motion will pass by a narrow margin. The question becomes how intrusive Parliament chooses to make the inquiry, and whether they'll respect traditional boundaries between governmental oversight and royal prerogative." Alexander nodded, accepting the inevitable. "And if they find evidence of actual wrongdoing during their investigation? Then we address each revelation as it emerges, maintaining your innocence while demonstrating complete cooperation with proper authorities." The monarchy has survived scandals before by adapting, rather than resisting necessary changes. The Parliament building's Gothic architecture loomed imposing against gray clouds as their car approached. Protesters lined the streets, their chants audible through the bulletproof windows. Alexander could see both supporters and detractors, some waving Valdorian flags and expressing solidarity with their king, others demanding justice and governmental reform. Inside the building, Alexander was escorted to a private chamber where he could monitor the proceedings. Constitutional tradition prevented the monarch from attending parliamentary debates directly, but technology allowed him to watch as elected representatives discussed his fate and the future of his kingdom. The debate proved painful to witness. Opposition speakers painted him as out of touch, suggesting the monarchy had become a corrupt institution that drained resources while contributing nothing to modern Valdoria. Government supporters defended royal traditions and questioned the timing of the allegations, but their arguments sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. When the vote was called, Alexander watched the electronic tally appear on screens throughout the chamber. The motion to investigate royal finances passed by 12 votes, closer than predicted, but sufficient to authorize a comprehensive audit of palace accounts, royal investments, and charitable foundations associated with the crown. The immediate aftermath was swift and devastating. Within hours, financial investigators arrived at the palace with warrants and equipment, treating the royal residence like a crime scene. Staff members were questioned, computer files copied, and decades of financial records seized for analysis. The indignity of watching strangers rifle through private documents and family photographs left Alexander feeling violated and powerless. Elena arrived unexpectedly during the height of the chaos, having cancelled her own engagements to offer support. She navigated the palace corridors filled with investigators and lawyers, maintaining her composure despite the surreal circumstances. Her presence provided the first genuine comfort Alexander had felt since the crisis began. "I thought you might need a friendly face today," she said simply as they walked through the private gardens, away from the intrusion inside. "This must feel like an invasion of everything you hold sacred." It's difficult to maintain dignity when your life's work is being treated as evidence of criminal activity," Alexander replied. "Every decision I've made, every expenditure I've approved, every relationship I've cultivated, all of it is now suspect." Elena walked silently beside him for several minutes, allowing him space to process his emotions. Her intuitive understanding of when to speak and when to simply be present was one of her most valuable gifts. Unlike Isabella's retreat into formality, Elena offered companionship without judgment or agenda. "Marcus called this morning," she said eventually. "He's requested emergency leave to return home, but his commanding officers aren't sure they can approve it given the security situation overseas. He's frustrated about being away during such a difficult time. He serves his country by fulfilling his military obligations," Alexander said. "That's exactly what a future king should do, put duty above personal convenience. He also wants to protect his family," Elena added gently. "Marcus feels guilty about leaving you and the Queen to face this crisis alone. He worries that his absence makes him appear disloyal or uncommitted to the monarchy." They paused near an ancient oak tree that had stood on palace grounds for over 3 centuries. Its massive trunk bore scars from storms and seasons, yet it remained strong and deeply rooted. Alexander found comfort in its permanence, a reminder that some things endured despite temporary difficulties. "Tell Marcus that his greatest service to the crown right now is demonstrating that royal duty transcends personal interests," Alexander said. "Future kings must earn credibility through sacrifice and service, not by rushing home whenever challenges arise." Elena nodded, understanding the deeper message. The monarchy's survival depended on proving its relevance and value to modern citizens who questioned inherited privilege. Marcus's military service showed that royal family members contributed to society rather than simply enjoying its benefits. "What about Queen Isabella?" Elena asked carefully. "She seemed strained at last night's reception." "This pressure must be affecting her deeply." Alexander considered how much to share about his deteriorating relationship with his wife. Elena's question was motivated by genuine concern rather than gossip. But discussing marital problems felt like another betrayal of privacy that had already been violated by the investigation. "Isabella copes by focusing on external duties rather than internal struggles," he said finally. "She's always been more comfortable with public service than personal intimacy. The current crisis amplifies that tendency." Elena seemed to understand the implication without requiring explicit details. Her own marriage to Marcus was built on emotional connection and mutual support, making her particularly sensitive to relationships where those elements were absent or underdeveloped. "Sometimes people withdraw when they're afraid of losing something precious," she observed. "The Queen has devoted her entire adult life to serving Valdoria and building a legacy of charitable work. If she believes that legacy is threatened, she might protect herself by creating emotional distance from potential sources of pain." The insight was both accurate and generous, reflecting Elena's ability to see complex situations from multiple perspectives. Alexander appreciated her refusal to judge Isabella harshly, despite the obvious strain in the royal marriage. They returned to the palace as afternoon shadows lengthened, finding the investigation team still methodically cataloging financial records. Isabella had returned from her hospital dedication ceremony and was meeting with her private secretary, maintaining her scheduled appointments despite the chaos surrounding them. That evening, the 3 of them dined together in the small family dining room rather than the formal state dining room that seemed too grand for their reduced circumstances. The conversation remained superficial. Elena shared highlights from her recent charity work. Isabella reported on the successful hospital dedication, and Alexander provided updates on international diplomatic correspondence. Yet beneath the polite exchanges, tensions simmered. Isabella barely looked at her husband throughout the meal, addressing her comments primarily to Elena or speaking in generalities that didn't require personal engagement. Alexander found himself responding more warmly to Elena's observations and questions, grateful for her genuine interest in his thoughts and feelings. After dinner, Isabella excused herself to prepare for the next day's schedule, leaving Alexander and Elena alone in the sitting room adjacent to the dining area. The fire crackled softly in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls, lined with family portraits spanning generations of Valdorian royalty. "She's protecting herself," Elena said quietly, referring to Isabella's emotional withdrawal. "When people feel powerless to control external circumstances, they sometimes try to control their internal emotional exposure." "I understand her reasons," Alexander replied, "but it makes an already difficult situation even more isolating. We should be supporting each other through this crisis, but instead we're becoming strangers in our own home." Elena curled into one corner of the velvet sofa, tucking her legs beneath her in a gesture that reminded Alexander she was still quite young despite her royal responsibilities. Her informality was refreshing in a world where every gesture was typically calculated and ceremonial. "What do you need right now?" she asked directly. Not as a king or a public figure, but as a person dealing with extraordinary stress and uncertainty. The question caught Alexander off guard with its simplicity and directness. Most people, including Isabella, focused on what he should do, how he should respond, what strategies would protect the monarchy. Elena was the first person to ask what he personally needed during this ordeal. "Honestly, I need to believe that someone still sees me as something other than a scandal to be managed," he said. "I need to feel like my life's work meant something, that the commitments I've made and the sacrifices I've accepted weren't meaningless." Elena leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Your dedication to this kingdom has touched millions of lives, the hospitals, schools, and cultural institutions that exist because of royal patronage, the diplomatic relationships you've built that have prevented conflicts and fostered cooperation, the example of service you've provided to inspire others. None of that is diminished by these accusations." Her words carried conviction that penetrated deeper than mere reassurance. Elena understood the weight of public service and the personal costs of dedicating one's life to something larger than individual desires. Her perspective carried credibility because she had chosen similar sacrifices in her own marriage and royal role. "Sometimes I wonder if Isabella regrets the choice she made 25 years ago," Alexander admitted. "Our marriage was arranged for political reasons, but she embraced her role wholeheartedly. Now that role is under attack, and I'm the source of the threat to everything she's built." "Queen Isabella is a remarkable woman who has served Valdoria with distinction," Elena said carefully. "Right now, she's probably afraid of losing everything that's given her life meaning. That fear might make her seem distant, but it doesn't erase decades of partnership and shared accomplishment." Alexander appreciated Elena's diplomatic response, though he suspected she recognized the fundamental problems in his marriage more clearly than she was willing to express. Her loyalty to the family prevented her from criticizing Isabella directly, but her empathy toward his situation spoke volumes. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 o'clock, its resonant tones echoing through the quiet palace. Most of the household staff had retired for the evening, leaving the royal family in peaceful solitude that contrasted sharply with the day's invasive chaos. "I should let you rest," Elena said, beginning to rise from the sofa. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges, and you'll need your strength to face whatever develops." "Stay a few more minutes," Alexander said, surprising himself with the request. "It's been helpful having someone to talk with honestly. I don't want to return to my study and spend the evening alone with my doubts and fears." Elena settled back into her corner of the sofa, understanding his need for companionship without making it feel awkward or inappropriate. Her presence was comfortable and undemanding, offering support without expecting anything in return. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the fire gradually diminish to glowing embers. Outside, the palace grounds were quiet, except for the distant footsteps of security guards maintaining their vigilant patrols. Inside, the ancient building seemed to breathe around them, filled with centuries of history and countless previous crises that had eventually passed. When Elena finally departed for her own quarters, Alexander felt the loneliness return, like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He walked slowly through the palace corridors toward his private study, past portraits of ancestors who had faced their own trials and emerged with varying degrees of success. The investigation would continue tomorrow, potentially uncovering more damaging evidence, or perhaps beginning to exonerate him through lack of concrete proof. Either way, the monarchy would never be quite the same, and neither would his relationships with the people he cared about most. 3 weeks into the investigation, the first breakthrough came not from the parliamentary inquiry, but from an unexpected source. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, leading the Financial Crimes Unit's parallel investigation, discovered anomalies in the digital signatures of the allegedly incriminating documents. The forensic analysis revealed sophisticated forgeries so expertly crafted that they had initially fooled even experienced auditors. Alexander received the news in his study at dawn. Lord Blackwood, arriving with Chen's preliminary report, and barely contained excitement. The elderly chancellor's hands trembled slightly as he laid out the technical evidence that suggested an elaborate frame-up rather than genuine royal corruption. The metadata shows these documents were created months after their supposed dates, Blackwood explained, his voice thick with emotion. Someone with considerable resources and technical expertise orchestrated this entire scandal. Detective Inspector Chen believes we're dealing with a coordinated attack on the monarchy itself. Alexander studied the forensic analysis, trying to process the implications. Relief warred with anger as he realized the extent to which he and his family had been manipulated. The past month of anguish, the damage to his marriage, the invasion of privacy, the public humiliation, all of it based on fabricated evidence designed to destroy everything he had spent his life building. Who would have the resources and motivation to mount such an operation? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The investigation is focusing on members of the Republican coalition and their international supporters, Blackwood replied grimly. Several key figures have been in communication with foreign entities who would benefit from destabilizing Valdoria's constitutional monarchy. This appears to be part of a larger campaign to eliminate royal institutions across Europe. The revelation transformed Alexander's perspective on everything that had transpired. Isabella's withdrawal suddenly seemed less like personal rejection and more like the natural response of someone watching their life's work crumble due to forces beyond their control. The isolation he had felt was shared by his entire family, all of them victims of a calculated assault on their integrity and service. However, the damage to relationships couldn't be easily repaired, even with vindication on the horizon. Trust, once broken, required more than evidence to rebuild. The crisis had revealed fundamental weaknesses in his marriage that existed independent of external pressures. Isabella's instinct to retreat into formality during difficulties, his own sense of isolation despite being surrounded by people who cared about him. These were long-standing patterns that the scandal had merely brought into sharp focus. When he shared the news with Isabella later that morning, her reaction was characteristically controlled. She listened to Blackwood's explanation with focused attention, asked several pertinent questions about the evidence, and expressed satisfaction that the truth was beginning to emerge. Yet her emotional response remained muted, professional rather than personal. "This is excellent news for the monarchy and for Valdoria," she said after Blackwood departed. "We should coordinate with the palace communications staff to ensure the information is released strategically. The people deserve to know they've been deceived, but we must present the facts carefully to maximize credibility." Alexander watched his wife's face as she spoke, searching for signs of relief or joy that their ordeal was ending. Instead, he saw the same careful composure she had maintained throughout the crisis, competent, appropriate, but emotionally distant. The vindication hadn't bridged the gap between them. If anything, it highlighted how far apart they had grown. "Isabella," he said gently, "we've been through something traumatic together. Don't you think we should talk about how it's affected us personally, not just politically?" She paused in organizing the documents Blackwood had left, her hands stilling for a moment before resuming their efficient movements. "I think we should focus on moving forward constructively, rather than dwelling on difficulties that are now behind us." The deflection confirmed what Alexander had begun to understand during their weeks of separation. Isabella's emotional withdrawal wasn't merely a temporary response to crisis, it was her fundamental approach to dealing with anything that threatened her carefully constructed world of duty and service. She had built walls around her heart so thoroughly that even vindication couldn't tear them down. Elena arrived that afternoon, having rushed back from a charity event in the northern provinces when she received word of the breakthrough. Her joy was immediate and unrestrained, the first genuine celebration Alexander had witnessed since the crisis began. She embraced him warmly, tears of relief streaming down her face as she expressed gratitude that the truth was finally emerging. "I never doubted your integrity for a moment," she said firmly, her hands still gripping his shoulders. "But knowing you were suffering while people questioned everything you've dedicated your life to, it was heartbreaking to watch." Her emotional investment in his vindication moved Alexander profoundly. Unlike Isabella's measured response, Elena's reaction came from the heart, unfiltered by considerations of political strategy or public image. She cared about him as a person first, a king second, a distinction that had become increasingly important to him during the lonely weeks of the investigation. They spent the afternoon walking through the palace gardens, discussing the implications of the revelation and planning for the monarchy's recovery. Elena's insights proved invaluable. She understood both the political necessities and the human elements involved in rebuilding public trust. More importantly, she provided the emotional support that had been missing from his other relationships. "The people of Valdoria will forgive being deceived once they understand what really happened," she said, as they paused near the fountain at the garden's center. "But you'll need to show them that you understand their concerns and are committed to transparency going forward." "And what about rebuilding trust within my own family?" Alexander asked, thinking of his increasingly distant relationship with Isabella. Elena was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Some relationships are damaged by crisis, while others are strengthened. The Queen has served Valdoria faithfully for decades, but perhaps this experience has revealed that your marriage serves institutional needs more than personal ones." The observation was gentle but honest, acknowledging what they both understood without being disrespectful to Isabella. Elena possessed a remarkable ability to see complex situations clearly, while maintaining compassion for everyone involved. Her perspective helped Alexander understand his own feelings without guilt or recrimination. That evening, the royal family gathered for dinner in the state dining room for the first time since the investigation began. The formal setting felt appropriate for marking the beginning of their recovery, though the atmosphere remained somewhat strained. Isabella participated in conversation about next steps and public relations strategy, but her interactions with Alexander remained cordial rather than intimate. Marcus had finally received permission to return home and would arrive the following morning. Elena's excitement about reuniting with her husband was evident in her animated discussion of his military service and their plans for his brief leave. Her joy provided a stark contrast to the polite but passionless dynamic between Alexander and Isabella. After dinner, Alexander found himself alone with Isabella in the library where they had often spent quiet evenings during the early years of their marriage. The room's leather-bound books and comfortable furniture had once provided a refuge where they could relax together away from the pressures of public life. Tonight, however, the space felt formal and impersonal. "I need to say something that's been weighing on my mind," Alexander began, settling into the chair across from where Isabella sat with her correspondence. "These past weeks have been difficult in ways that go beyond the public scandal. I feel like we've lost something important in our relationship." Isabella set down her fountain pen and regarded him with the same polite attention she might give to any serious conversation. "We've both been under tremendous pressure, Alexander. Once things return to normal, I'm sure we'll find our equilibrium again." "What if this is our normal?" he asked gently. "What if the crisis revealed that we've been going through the motions of marriage without maintaining the emotional connection that should sustain it?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge neither wanted to accept fully. Isabella's composed expression didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes, perhaps acknowledgement, perhaps relief that he had voiced what they both understood. "We've built something important together," she said finally. "Our partnership has served Valdoria well, and our marriage has provided stability for the monarchy. Those aren't small accomplishments." "No, they're not," Alexander agreed. "But they're institutional achievements rather than personal ones. We've been successful colleagues more than devoted spouses." Isabella nodded slowly. her characteristic honesty preventing her from denying what had become obvious to both of them. Perhaps that's enough. Not every marriage needs to be a passionate love story. Mutual respect and shared purpose have value too. The conversation continued late into the evening, both of them finally acknowledging truths they had avoided confronting for years. They spoke with the kindness of old friends rather than the intimacy of lovers, recognizing that their relationship had evolved into something different from traditional marriage but valuable in its own way. The next morning brought Marcus's return and with it, a burst of energy that had been missing from the palace for weeks. Elena's radiant happiness as she reunited with her husband provided a vivid reminder of what passionate commitment looked like. Their obvious devotion to each other filled the palace with warmth and hope, showing everyone what love could accomplish even in difficult circumstances. Alexander watched the young couple with mixed emotions, joy for their happiness, but also a profound sense of loss for what he had never experienced in his own marriage. Their relationship represented everything he and Isabella lacked: emotional intimacy, mutual support during difficulties, and the kind of partnership that strengthened both individuals. The official announcement of the investigation's findings came 3 days later. Detective Inspector Chen presented her evidence at a press conference that attracted international attention, revealing the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy against the monarchy. The fabricated documents, the coordinated media campaign, the timing designed to maximize political damage, all of it was laid out with forensic precision that left no doubt about the king's innocence. Public reaction was swift and decisive. Citizens who had questioned Alexander's integrity now expressed outrage at being manipulated by foreign interests seeking to destabilize their country. Opposition politicians who had called for his abdication found themselves defending their own involvement in what was clearly a coordinated attack on Valdorian democracy. The vindication should have felt triumphant, but Alexander found himself emotionally drained rather than celebratory. The truth had emerged, but the cost had been significant. His relationship with Isabella remained cordial but distant, their marriage continuing as a practical arrangement rather than an emotional bond. The isolation he had felt during the crisis persisted despite being surrounded by supporters and well-wishers. A week after the revelation, Elena found him in the palace's art gallery, standing before a portrait of his parents during their coronation 40 years earlier. King Edmund and Queen Catherine had shared a love story that became legendary, their devotion to each other and their kingdom inspiring generations of citizens who saw them as the embodiment of royal ideals. "They look so certain of their purpose," Elena observed, joining him in contemplating the majestic painting. "Your father's expression shows complete confidence in his ability to serve, while your mother radiates support and partnership. They were fortunate to find both love and duty in the same relationship," Alexander replied. "Most of us have to choose between personal happiness and institutional obligations." Elena turned to study his profile, her perceptive gaze recognizing the deeper meaning behind his words. What if someone didn't have to choose? What if they found a way to honor both their responsibilities and their heart? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had previously acknowledged directly. Alexander met her eyes, seeing his own longing reflected in her compassionate expression. The connection they had developed during the crisis had grown into something deeper than friendship or family loyalty, something that promised the kind of partnership his parents had shared. The moment stretched as they stood close together in the quiet gallery, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own challenges and choices. Alexander reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against Elena's hand in a gesture that conveyed everything words couldn't express. Behind them, unnoticed, Isabella appeared in the gallery doorway. She observed the intimate tableau for several seconds, her husband's obvious emotional investment in their daughter-in-law, Elena's responsive warmth, the connection that excluded everyone else in their shared universe. Rather than anger or jealousy, Isabella felt something closer to understanding, perhaps even relief. She turned away quietly, leaving them to their moment of recognition. In the corridor outside, Isabella paused to compose herself, acknowledging what she had always known but never admitted, that love couldn't be manufactured through duty alone, and that everyone deserved the chance to experience the kind of connection she had witnessed between Alexander and Elena. The future would require difficult conversations, careful consideration of constitutional implications, and respect for everyone's feelings and dignity. But in that moment in the art gallery, surrounded by the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow, Alexander finally understood that duty and happiness didn't have to be mutually exclusive sometimes. They could be one and the same.